I'm Algernon Cash, and you're locked in. Welcome to today's episode of Locked In, where we delve into the pressing economic issues shaping our nation. Of course, I'm your host, Algernon Cash, and joining me today is Dr. Jeff Sarbaum, who is an esteemed senior economist from UNCG right here in the Triad area of North Carolina. This morning, the Bureau of Economic Analysis reported a 0.3% annualized contraction in the United States GDP for the first quarter of 2025, the first decline since early 2022. This downturn is largely attributed to a surge in imports ahead of a newly imposed tariff policy from the White House, which significantly skewed trade balances. Simultaneously, consumer confidence has plummeted to 86, marking the lowest level since May 2020, as households grapple with rising prices and economic uncertainty. Retailers are sounding alarms over potential empty shelves and escalating prices, raising concerns about the upcoming shopping seasons. In this episode, we'll unpack these developments with Dr. Sahlbaum, exploring their implications and what they signal for the road ahead. Dr. Sahlbaum, thank you for locking in. How are you?
I'm doing great, Algernon. How are you doing today? It's great to be here.
I am well. I'm well. You and I are new friends. We literally met a week ago from
Yes, we
today.
did.
And I had the chance to moderate a panel conversation called Unleashed Triad, hosted by Triad Local First on the campus of UNC Greensboro. And I was really impressed with your commentary. And I said, I've got to get you on the show. And the timing is absolutely perfect because we had some big economic news here today that I'm sure my audience wants to learn more about. But before we get into that, you are a senior economist at UNCG. The opinions that you'll share on today's show are your personal opinions and not opinions of the college itself. But just give my audience a little introduction on who you are and how you landed at UNCG.
Yeah, I've been at UNCG for 25 years now, and I'm primarily a teacher. I teach thousands of undergraduate students, often in a single year. I think I've taught about 20,000 students over the course of my career there. And I primarily teach courses in international economics and principles of economics courses. And I have a couple of national textbooks out there that I like to work on and try to keep up to date for the students.
Well, Dr. Sarbaum, I think all of us across America have been students of the economy at least the last 100 days. And I think many of us have been getting a crash course on how tariffs work and how interconnected the global economy is and just how sensitive things are here in the U.S. economy. So let's start there. I did mention that today we got a big report on what's happening with GDP. The United States economy contracted by 0.3% in the first quarter of 2025. I guess could you elaborate on the primary factors contributing to the decline?
Sure. I mean, this is the largest decline we've had since the outbreak of COVID. Typically, when you have more than 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, you start to talking about being in a recession. So I think this is sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of seeing a report this quarter that had negative GDP growth attached to it. Certainly, a lot of the layoffs at the federal level are harming consumer demand and expenditure. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the future looks like. So people are being a little more cautious about their expenditures. And all of those things lead to less purchasing, which leads to declines in economic growth. And the tariffs are certainly something that we're about to begin experiencing, I think, a little bit more in full force in the next number of weeks because we have a large number of container ships and things that are, going across the Pacific right now, and they are not necessarily full. And we've had CEOs commenting on the fact that there is a probability that we may see on empty store shelves or less availability of product in the future. And that sort of shortage can do nothing but lead to higher prices. The Yale Budget Institute has estimated that the tariffs, if left unchecked, are going to lead to, about a $3,000 to $4,000 increase in annual expenditure per household. Those sorts of increases in expenditure are also something that will put downward pressure on economic growth and also create inflationary pressures. So, my personal belief is that this negative GDP growth is not just a blip, but it might be the beginning of something that we're going to experience for a period of time over the summer, if not beyond.
When we get these reports, and especially the quarterly GDP number, it tends to be sort of rear view looking.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your position as an economist, how do you determine how much of what we're seeing is being influenced by current fiscal and monetary and trade policy and so forth, versus just trends that may have been emergent on their own?
So I think we were coming, into the current year in a period of strong economic growth, and certainly economies go through business cycles, and you could make the argument that maybe we were reaching a peak of one, but the level of disruption and uncertainty that has occurred in the last number of months, I think is somewhat independent and is what's driving a lot of what we're experiencing right now. So, is this primarily a result of the prior administration? There's probably a piece of it, but I would not go so far as to say this is all a result of the prior administration's policy.
Well, I think of course, the word of the year for 2025 is uncertainty. And I think what you're describing right now is the uncertainty that many CEOs and CFOs across the country are trying to figure out. I know just about every major publicly traded company has basically said, don't trust any guidance this year, or they've either pulled back their guidance because they're trying to figure out what's really going on. You mentioned the container ships. My cousin actually drives trucks, and so I was
Mm-hmm.
talking to him about this the other day. And I saw a news story where they were saying more and more of these container ships are either empty or they're just bypassing the West Coast port altogether because they don't have enough product to drop. How
Mm-hmm.
how does that start to proliferate into our economy?
Well, I think, like I said a bit ago, that we're sort of just at the tip of the iceberg of beginning to see some of the implications of these tariffs in relation to companies changing their ordering behavior and things. I mean, when you're looking at something like, 125% tariff, for all intents and purposes, that's really almost just like a quota, because it raises the price so dramatically that you're just not going to really have much in the way of consumption. And so you've got companies canceling orders, knowing that if they have to pay these prices either for finished goods or for parts that they need to produce their own goods, it's going to result in rises in production costs that make the products somewhat unsaleable to the American consumer. So there's a lot of order cancellation, and part of it is just the uncertainty of where these things going to go next. I mean, if it's 125% today and it's 50% tomorrow and then it's 10% or then it goes back up, you don't want to get caught being the one who makes the order right when the tariffs are at their peak. And so, you create a lot of hesitation to move forward with investment decisions. And, these are the things that are starting to show up, and they showed up today in this GDP report.
I was hanging out yesterday with a little small coffee shop owner. He also roasts his own coffee and he roasts coffee for other people here in our community here in Winston-Salem. And you don't think about the small cafe, on the corner of Main and Main being impacted by tariff policy, but he obviously buys the coffee from Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
And he started to talk about how the price of his coffee has pretty much doubled,
Mm-hmm.
in the past month or so. And so here's a really small, not even a small business owner, more like a micro entrepreneur that's being impacted by the global trade policy. The president recently did a rally yesterday marking his 100 days in office, and he explicitly said that the country is getting rich off these tariffs. Which part of my question is, are we able to really even truly determine that, considering we're less than a true month in? And then, do you see any impact to overall economic performance from this recent tariff policy that's been implemented?
Well, I think the most important thing for every American to remember is that a tariff is nothing more than a sales tax. And so what happens is when you impose a tariff on products coming out of China or anywhere else in the world, unless you have the power to influence global prices by buying less, which means you're a monopoly, which is not, the situation the United States is in. Perhaps it may have been, back in the 1960s, but what happens is the foreign manufacturers just simply pass on the cost of that tariff on to consumers. And so, to the extent that our government is generating tariff revenue, that is one perhaps positive that comes from a tariff. But make no mistake that that money is coming straight out of the pocketbooks of American consumers. It is not being paid for by foreign governments and foreign manufacturers. It's being paid for through a rise in price. And when consumers have to pay higher prices for some products, it means they've got less money in their pocket for other products. And there's jobs attached to those other products as well. So if I spend more money on an imported product and I don't have the money to go to the movies as a result, that might cost someone a job at the movie theater. So it's a lot more complicated than the notion that we're just going to impose tariffs and that's going to bring domestic industry running back.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty clear even by Apple's recent announcement that they are going to move iPhone production out of China, but they're
Mm-hmm.
going to move it to India. And so you're still not really creating any real jobs or manufacturing jobs here in our country. You talked about consumers, and I know here in our country we are big consumers. About two-thirds or maybe over two-thirds of our entire economic output is driven by consumption. So we really, really rely on the American consumer to push the economy. With consumer confidence dropping to its lowest level since May of 2020, that was back when COVID was raging. What are some of the potential repercussions on consumer spending and ultimately economic growth this year?
I mean, I think there's a lot of negative pressure on economic growth right now. Consumer sentiment is way down, and whenever consumer sentiment goes down, consumers tighten up their wallets out of fear for what tomorrow might look like. And when that occurs, you sort of create a self-fulfilling prophecy because if everybody stops spending out of fear, then the fear comes true, and you end up in a recession. And so I would really like to see a lot more certainty out there so that people are just in a place where they have a better understanding of what the rules of the game are right now in terms of decision making. I have a friend of mine who owns a small company, and he sources all of his uh, parts that he needs from China. And he was telling me the other day that he's going to be bankrupt in about 2 months.
Hmm. Wow, that's got to be tough to take in. Yeah. Like I said, even sitting with this cafe owner and listen to how he's trying to navigate between does he raise prices or what does he do because he doesn't want to shock his customer. That's a tough situation to be in. I think that whenever we see these types of announcements about what's going on with the economy, or you hear the types of stories that you just shared with us, I believe the president's supporters are often clamoring to find at least some positive news in all this. I know that there was a California Congress member who's part of the Republican Party that was actually saying that the economic report was good news, and I'm not sure how you spin that, but um, some supporters of the president would argue that the price of oil has went down. I think it's at $59 a barrel, so that's a great thing. They would also argue that interest rates have come down. I think the 10-year today is trading at 4.2 or something like that. I look at that, Dr. Sarbaum, and say, okay, those are good things, but they're happening for the wrong reasons. What's your perspective of it?
Well, I think certainly unemployment is rising right now. Certainly with all of the federal layoffs, and that's creating a softening of the economy. interest rates going down is certainly a good thing for stimulating economic growth. It's going to be very challenging to maintain low interest rates if we get into an inflationary environment. One of my big concerns would be that these tariffs are similar to what might be considered a supply shock, sort of like what we experienced during the OPEC oil embargoes, where there's a big rise in production costs, and that results in rising prices as well as rising unemployment at the same time. And that's a really difficult thing for the Fed to handle because, when both of those things are happening at the same time, the policy only works on one of them and makes the other one typically worse. So that's going to be a real challenge if we get into what would be referred to as a stagflationary environment. And you mentioned that, there's some indication that prices are coming down. And, I'm fingers crossed that that's the case. But, the way the tariffs are currently in place and the kinds of things I'm hearing about what products are and primarily are not coming across and the empty containers, that there's no way that can't lead to tremendous upward pressure on price over the next 6 to 8 weeks would be what I'm hearing through the grapevine.
Yeah, and I think oil prices are coming down because I think growth is slowing. It's not because of the tariff policy, but people are starting to price in slower economic growth, and that's going to drive the price of oil down. Also, it's going to drive supplies higher. It's going to mess with production. Again, I think it's just something that this administration is sort of hanging its hat on to try to argue that something positive is occurring. And same thing with interest rates. I think rates are coming down because people are pulling money out of the stock market and trying to go into a safe haven like treasuries, and that's driving the yield down. It's sort of like when you go to Chick-fil-A and they say, well, hey, we're going to give you a free chicken sandwich, but oh, by the way, it might poison you. So you're happy to get the free sandwich, but you are unhappy with the reason why you're getting the free sandwich. And I think that's a little bit of what's occurring right now. On the panel conversation a week ago when we initially met, I asked a couple of questions about stagflation. And
Mm-hmm.
for my audience, I do have a new article or a new piece in the Carolina Journal that talks about stagflation, and you can go pick up the Carolina Journal. I encourage you to read that. For my audience here today, Dr. Sarbaum, many people don't know about stagflation. It's not something that we've had to deal with for a very long time, like many, many decades.
Right.
But when I look at the trends and I hear the insights from smart people like you and a lot of other economists, I am starting to hear that phrase stagflation more and more. I'm hearing more about contagion,
Mm-hmm.
things starting to spread out of the stock market and into the broader economy. For my audience, could you give us a quick education on what triggers stagflation, and does the Federal Reserve have the right tools to fight it if that's where we're going this year?
Right. So it's a really good question, and I think it's one of the biggest concerns out there right now amongst economists. The closest parallel would probably be the OPEC oil embargo and the oil price shocks we experienced in the late 1970s when the price of oil and gasoline was going up 2 and 3-fold. And if you think about, the magnitude of some of these tariffs, those are sort of the same numbers. If you're talking 100% increase in the price due to a tariff, and I particularly think it's a similar magnitude, when oil is a small percentage of the input of the total product that's being produced, whereas the tariff is on the entire product. So you need a smaller tariff rate to have the same sort of magnitude of impact as a higher rise in the price of oil. But what happens is when all production costs go up, that raises costs of production. And when costs of production go up dramatically, it decreases people's ability to spend. And then when that happens, economies start to slow down. And when that happens, unemployment will start to rise. And traditionally, when you have rising unemployment, the strategy would be to lower interest rates, and then that would stimulate borrowing and investment. And that's a very typical response to a typical business cycle where there's changes in demand from, one period to the next. But when you have these negative supply shocks, what you have is you have rising prices and rising unemployment at the same time. And so the traditional policy tool of cutting interest rates when you have unemployment is the exact opposite of the policy tool you want if you're trying to fight inflation. So you're stuck in a real catch-22. You want to fight inflation, you have to raise interest rates. That puts downward pressure on investment. That puts pressure on employment to go up. You want to fight unemployment, you cut interest rates. That promotes expenditure and employment, but it also puts pressure on prices to go up. And so, you're kind of on handcuffed as a Fed. And I think we also talked previously about fiscal policy. And, you really could think about the job losses that are occurring across the board in the federal government as almost a contractionary fiscal policy, in the sense that you're cutting expenditure rather than increasing expenditure, which would be, the response during a period of an economic downturn by the government is to increase expenditure.
Yeah, it's a great point you just made at the end. I really like that because you're right. When we typically go in a macroeconomic slowdown where private companies and individuals aren't able to make the same kind of contribution, it's government that steps in and sort of keeps things a little bit more propped up and balanced until we can get back into a normally functioning cycle. But you bring up a great point. It doesn't not only, and it's a great point, but it's scary at the same time what you just said because not only do we not have a lot of bullets in the gun in terms of a monetary policy, we don't have a lot of bullets in the gun in terms of fiscal policy either, with the type of spending that we've been doing, and not necessarily paying our bills here. That's really fascinating. I may have to actually just bring you back here later this year just to further explore that idea. That's really interesting. I'm also starting to hear about some oil companies, domestic oil companies in this country that are starting to run into problems. I mean, as the price of oil per barrel continues to drop, for some of these oil companies that might be producing or going for oil in tougher strategic areas, it becomes it's not worthwhile to continue to do so because you can't get the price you need on the market. How does that start to impact the broader economy?
Um, I mean, that's not really an area of my focus, but I would say that, to the extent that we have interest in trying to move toward, more sustainable types of production and environmental kinds of initiatives, that, when you have falling prices for oil, it tends to disincentivize investments in some of these other types of technologies because the oil is inexpensive. The other thing it does is when the price of oil goes down, presumably the reason oil is coming from where it comes from is because that's the cheapest place to produce it. And so if it's potentially more expensive to produce it in another location, then the falling price of oil is going to make it certainly harder for you to be able to tap into that market because it's not going to be profitable for you.
No, I totally agree. I just got a couple of more questions, even though I could do this all evening with you. My audience knows that I'm a nerd when it comes to either history or the economy. I absolutely love learning about it. Again, I know you're sharing a lot of your commentary personally. It's not on behalf of the university. We want to make sure we repeat that as well. But, from a policy perspective, we just had a really good conversation about fiscal and monetary policy. Is there anything that you would recommend if all of a sudden President Trump called Dr. Sarbaum and said, "Hey, I want to meet with you in the Oval Office for an hour"? Are there any policies that you would recommend to try to mitigate these challenges?
Well, I think the most important thing right now is to just communicate in a way that creates certainty, so people know what the situation is. If it's going to be a tariff rate of X%, let everybody know that that's what it's going to be and that's where it's going to stand, so that people can start to make decisions on, when you're talking about, all of the things that we've been talking about, much of what is driving this is the uncertainty of not knowing what's coming next. And the hardest thing to do when it comes to, making effective business decisions is to try to do so when there are a lot of unknowns.
I totally understand. But and here's my last question. This is going to be a loaded one. I know economists you hate to get this question, but I got to put it out there.
All
Considering
right.
all the factors that we've talked about today, what are you forecasting for the U.S. economy in 2025? Where are we going?
You know, I always tell people if I had a crystal ball and knew the answer to that, I'd be on a sailboat in the Bahamas. But I would say the probability of us going into a recession continues to rise. Um, but beyond that, I really can't predict where things are going to go because there's so much uncertainty. We don't know how China is going to respond. We don't know how the rest of the world is going to respond. We don't know what the tariffs are going to look like in the next 30 to 90 days. And all of this makes it, almost impossible to predict where things are going. But that said, seeing that we just had a period of negative economic growth this early into all of these changes, it's hard for me not to believe that, all of the economists, many of whom are, far more you know, well known than me as macroeconomists, are all predicting, a greater than 50% chance that we're in a recession, within the next 6 to 9 months. And I would certainly have no reason to think any of those influential people are wrong.
I think that's a fair answer, and it gives me great reason to invite you back later in the year to continue this conversation.
I
We'll
would love
continue.
to do that, and I'll try to get some better lighting on my face. I see myself
No, it's
going
all
in and out of the shadows.
your commentary was far more important than the visual today, and I know that my audience learned some things today because I learned some things today. So thank you, Dr. Sarbaum, for your invaluable insights into these complex economic issues. As we've discussed, the United States economy is in a pivotal juncture, facing challenges that require careful navigation and informed policy making. We'll continue to monitor these developments closely, keep our listeners informed. So stay tuned for more in-depth analysis in our upcoming episodes. And as always, I appreciate Dr. Sarbaum locking in. I appreciate you locking in. Make sure you stay tuned to WTOB because every Sunday morning, that's where you can lock in with me. But if you happen to miss me there, hopefully you are subscribed to the podcast. You can get that on Pandora, Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to get your favorite podcasts. You can always lock in there. And until next time, y'all stay locked in.